Would big cities thrive if residents approached where they live with the same care they bring to their most personal relationships? We'll talk about loving where you live with author Peter Kageyama next on UCF Metro Center Outlook.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metro Center, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.
Hello everyone, welcome to UCF Metro Center Outlook. I'm Diane Trees, Director of the UCF Metro Center and your host for Metro Center Outlook. Joining us today is Peter Kageyama, author of For the Love of Cities, the love affair between people and their places. He joins us today to talk about the benefits of civic pride and the power a city's people have over economic development. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, pleasure to be here.
Your book, For the Love of Cities, you have love in red, big capital letters. Why the choice of that word?
Well, it's evocative. It's something that touches us. When you say love, it's a universal concept. Now,
but I would associate it more with people and not with a city.
Well, that's kind of what I'm trying to tease out with that. I need people to recognize that we're actually in this relationship with our places, yet we don't think about it as a relationship. You know, we're very conscious of our relationship with people, family, our business relationships, very important, very much, analyzed. But this other relationship that we have with our place is in that triumvirate of, those three most important things, and we don't think about it like that.
No,
so
it's very different.
It was intentional to call that out and to use this, a term that we don't necessarily associate with cities.
Where'd you come up with the idea for the book? What was the passion for you there? Because it shows in the book.
Well, for years I'd been sort of working in this area of community and economic development. I was producing conferences, produced a couple little documentary films, and was working with some of the great thinkers and writers and speakers around, these ideas. And I was meeting these amazing people as I was traveling around, really around the world. And it became obvious that there was this common thread of I was meeting people who were passionately in love with their places, and I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. And we're not talking about them as this source of community and economic development, yet clearly they were having these major impacts in the places that they lived. I thought, this may be what I want to talk about. So yeah, it was just seeing the impact that they were having.
When you talk about loving a city, what determines what is lovable, what cities are lovable?
Well, ultimately, that's a personal choice. You and I may agree. And it's like, oh, we love these cities. Like, oh, I hate this city, or that city never worked for me, and that's fine.
You hit on a number of them that I totally agreed with you in the book.
Well, because there's certain things in common about the cities that I think we engage with emotionally. And I think it has to do with factors that make them somewhat approachable, somewhat human, and somewhat engaging. I list cities, and I make the analogy of there's certain star cities that are always at the top of people's lists. San Francisco, Portland, Austin, New York, London, San Francisco, places like that. And I liken them to sort of supermodels. It's easy to project the idea of the supermodels, like, oh, they're beautiful, they're gorgeous. Of course, you could love them. It's like, okay, that's true. But there's also cities that are fairly lovable. Places like Pittsburgh, your hometown.
Yes.
I'm from Ohio. Places like Cleveland, places like Detroit, that probably don't show up on most people's sort of best of list, but they have this heart to them. And there's something about those kinds of places. And I think it does go back to sort of those human factors, approachability, fairness, openness.
Well, those are some of the elements that you mentioned in the survey that had been taken. There were three elements. I think that you even said the soul of what a city be. And openness, I think, was ranked first.
Yes, that you're referring to the Knight community, or the Knight Foundation did the Soul of the Community survey. And it was a fairly exhaustive study between 2008 and 2010. And they looked at community engagement and levels of engagement. Essentially, they were taking the temperature of our relationship with our places. And they found that the three key drivers for that, one was aesthetics, how does a place look? Social offerings, okay, what is there to do? And then it was openness. And openness in the sense that it was inviting. And I like to use the analogy, it's like, if they're okay with me and my weirdness, then they're probably going to be okay with you and your weirdness. So that feels like a place where you could live and thrive in a place like that.
You talk about loving the city. Do you think that has grown increasingly important with us, especially with the economy,
Yeah.
we seem to be gloom all the time.
Yeah.
It was a very positive essence out of the book.
I think it's always been important, but I think certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, I think it's become even more important, and we're certainly more conscious of it. Right now, cities all over the world, are facing, their own fiscal cliffs, if you will, and really tight fiscal constraints, and they're having to ask themselves, how do I continue to make my city better when I don't really have, nearly the resources that I had before? And citizens expect their cities to continue to get better. They don't care that, the coffers are fairly bare. They just expect the city to get better. So I think what cities are having to do is turn to this other side of things. Like, well, we can't do the big projects. Maybe what we could do is more of these little things. And a lot of these little things have to do with this sort of emotional engagement. A bridge is huge, it's significant, and things like that. But, a little pocket park has a different sort of emotional quality to it.
Well, you talk about the little things. What would you say for a person that wants to be engaged, but our lives are so complicated? We have businesses. What are some of the simple ways that somebody can be engaged and bring that feeling of love in their city?
Well, one of the most obvious ones is volunteer. There's all kinds of projects that are already going on. So those folks who want to feel like they want to do something, they don't necessarily have to originate a new project
or build a bridge,
or build their own bridge, or start their own whatever. If they look around, there's probably lots of really interesting stuff that's happening in their own neighborhood that they could dial into and sort of get their feet wet.
When you say volunteer, are you talking about volunteering like for a nonprofit or?
Well, that's certainly the sort of the traditional kind of way.
To bring that attachment, is that?
That's part of it. But there's this whole other group. We tend to think of volunteer for those formal organizations.
Right.
But look around. There's all kinds of these very informal organizations. People are getting together and doing amazing things, and they're not part of any particular 501c3. They're just a group of citizens who want to get together. They're doing something that has probably a huge social component to it, and they're having fun while doing it. A great example I love out of Detroit, as a friend of mine. They started out as this little soccer club. They play the Detroit Football League. They're playing soccer in this neighborhood. Yeah. And so the guys and women in this neighborhood, they got together, and when a house would go vacant and things like that, they would actually go in, they'd buy the plywood, they'd go in, they'd cover the windows, and then they'd spray paint little designs on it and things like that. So
not what I would have thought of doing.
Well, no, but they're trespassing. But they're saying, they're being proactive and saying, no, this is our neighborhood. We're going to make sure that it doesn't go to seed. They'll mow people's lawns and things like that. They'll again paint and little things like that. That's the kind of stuff people can dial into.
So a little bit unconventional, but it doesn't hurt us to think out of the box to do that.
You don't just have to go and volunteer
at the nonprofit.
At the nonprofit, you could probably
not
find
that that's bad, but
no, it's not bad at all. But you could probably find something that's probably maybe even a little bit more fun. Maybe even something that is already in your wheelhouse. Maybe something. Oh yeah, I could get behind that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the city leadership then. Do you think that city leaders are doing enough to get people engaged or invested in their city? If you're like me, I would have thought when you said volunteer, nonprofit, I don't think about those other things.
I think city leaders are trying very hard to do this. Certainly, I'm a big fan of Mayor Dyer.
Mayor Dyer's been
He's been a huge proponent of this kind of thinking, and and I think not every mayor or city leader is sort of in the same place, but I think they're coming at it from that same point. Hey, look, we do want help. Yeah. And I think part of the challenge is to get out of the old playbook, which said, oh, volunteer, for the typical 501c3 kind of thing. What I'm trying to get people to do is say, well, there's that playbook, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that maybe we need to start thinking
about.
Options there's other options.
Yes.
And I think that that leaders, once they're made aware of these things and these options, they kind of get it. They go, okay, yeah, that's great. We can add to the arsenal that we have.
When you travel extensively, and you've traveled all over the world, you just came back from Barcelona.
I did.
But your message is consistent with a bottom-up community development. What does that mean?
Well, it means, we're sort of used to the idea of cities being sort of made for us, that the city makers, the mayor, council, the administrators, the bureaucracy, those folks, okay, we consume the city. That's our job as citizens. And in return, we pay our taxes, we obey the law, we spend our money.
It's the structure.
That's sort of the deal. The bottom-up kind of stuff happens when we as citizens say, you know what, I'm not willing to wait for the city to do this. Or, hey, look, we're better able to fix our neighborhood or our little corner of our neighborhood than waiting for some department, at City Hall. And so we take a bit of ownership and we take a bit of responsibility and say, we're going to do something like that. And what happens is people get confidence from doing that. They go, hey, we didn't get into trouble. We fixed it. It was fun. And people said, hey, they congratulate you. There's a very positive sort of feedback loop in that. And they go, well, let's do something else.
Well, your book is full of some really wonderful examples of ingenuity that people come up with some wild and crazy ideas.
People are amazing, you know, and I think part of the, you know, the best leadership is actually giving a little bit of room to those folks to operate. And they're not going in and trying to control it. They're not trying to squelch it by standing on all kinds of rules and regulations. They're saying, you know what, we're all in this together. We're trying to make the city a better place. We'll look the other way a little bit on that. That may not, that's skirting a line and things like that. You know, they don't want things to be dangerous, obviously, but you don't want to squelch that enthusiasm.
That momentum and the encouragement that goes along. But it is a fine line to, some of the ideas that were coming out really were amazing to see. Now you talk about a 0.1% solution. Explain that a little bit and how you came up with it.
Well, actually, it has its origins in the internet communities and things like that. And people have been talking about this for years. As internet communities have been built, they've noticed that you know, everybody will come and use the community. And the example I like to use is Wikipedia. Most everyone has probably used Wikipedia at one point or another. And you ask the question, well, how many people have actually ever made an entry for Wikipedia? And, you know, and I'll ask that, you know, in front of several hundred people, and, you know, a few hands will go up.
Do they?
Yeah, a few. And I'll say more than 5. And there'll maybe be one lone hand that will go up. And that's actually what they found around these virtual communities. It's called participation inequality, in the sense that the vast majority of people just sort of consume. There's a fairly small number of people who are active, and a very, very small number of people who are hyperactive and making all that content. Because think about that. If less than 1% of the total users of Wikipedia, which is what the data shows, are making all that content, then we're talking about millions of man-hours of content.
That's a huge, yes.
But essentially, the rest of us are just sort of coasting along with that.
I use it all the time.
Yeah. And so I started to think about that, and I think that physical communities follow that same pattern, in the sense that there's a very small number of people who are actually making the content that we all consume. And if, you know, if there's a city of 100,000 people, you know, then that means that 1/10 or 1% means, you know, there's 1,000 people that are really making the content. And if we could increase that number, those content creators, both official and unofficial, by just 1/10, by 100 people, you'd have an exponential impact on the quality of life in those cities, because they're going to create content, they're going to make stuff happen, they're going to start businesses, they're going to start movements, they're going to connect people, and they're going to make really interesting things happen. So I try to focus on that small number, which seems very attainable for most cities. You know, everyone's talking about, well, we need, you know, to attract, you know, the creative class, we need more young professionals, all this kind of stuff, and they're talking about these big numbers that kind of seem tough. Well, if we can reduce that down to a manageable number of maybe a few hundred people, sometimes maybe even a few dozen people, the right folks, the ones, again, who are going to make amazing things happen, that seems attainable.
Well, I would think that once you get some of these ideas going, that even people who aren't creative like me, but might not have ever thought of something, that I would be enthused to be part of a project like that and see what the results could be for the community.
Yeah. Well, emotions are very contagious, you know, and when we're talking about love and fun and excitement and things like that, it's easy for people to get sort of swept up in that. And that's really what I'm trying to encourage is, you know, people, you know, making cities is hard work. There's no doubt about it. But if we can make it, you know, if we can make it fun and emotionally engaging and satisfying and lovable, it's like, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Well, then you're saying that the elements of diversity and creativity are key elements in making a city lovable.
Absolutely. You know, and I reject your notion when people say that to me all the time. Oh, I'm not creative and things like that. We're all creative beings. We may not think of ourselves as creative because we're not an artist, we're not a singer, we're not a musician, things like that. And that's to me, that's an unfortunate and a narrow definition of creativity. We all do creative and innovative things, and maybe it's around, you know, being a mechanic.
I have a science background. I'm not creative, but I can appreciate it.
I think, you know, I think you're. We tend to think of that word, but I bet you would use the word innovative around being a scientist, right?
Yes.
Well, creativity and innovation are the opposite sides of the same coin. You know, creativity is sort of that open-ended, that sort of, you know, that widening of possibilities, and then innovation is looking at those possibilities and honing those in to something that becomes tangible and something that's valuable. So they are absolutely,
I could see that.
they are absolutely necessary, you know, components of each other. So, folks out there, Seriously, I want people to stop saying that they're not creative, because then it seems like it's up to somebody else to make that interesting solution happen. No, you've got the answers. You see the problems better than most. So who's to say that your solution is any less valid just because you don't think of yourself as a creative person? So,
I'll have to change my
stop doing that.
concept of that myself. Yes. What about cities in Central Florida? What do you think is the biggest challenge that we have for getting people to become engaged and love their cities?
Yeah, we're certainly.
We have some problems.
We do. We're a transient, state. They say what, a third of Florida's population was actually born here, which means we have this high turnover, which has a lot of benefits to that, no doubt about it. But part of the challenge with something like that is, how do we get people to feel like they have some ownership and they have some permanence and things like that? So we need to work, on those kinds of things. But I think ultimately that is a strength. There are places that have these long-standing roots. But they said they can feel more closed off, that there isn't enough room for me and my new ideas and things like that.
So we keep moving and changing, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that, culturally, I think we're sort of catching up to where Florida is, in the sense that, think about the rapidity of change and how, the transient nature of just about everything. The long term, what a generation ago we thought of long term, it's like, that seems forever. Now long term is 5 years.
Right.
Now, so I think the rest of the world is sort of catching up where Florida has already sort of psychically been, and the young professionals here today, I think they have a different sense of time in that sense, and I think they are probably more in the now. It's like they're not worried so much 5 years from now. It's like, hey, we want to make this place better now. I'll worry about where I'm going to be 5 years from now.
They enjoy the moment that they're in a little bit more.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
You talk about traditions and rituals. What are some of the ones, for Central Florida for me, is the St. Pete area where you're from, across the state, even all the way over to Daytona and Volusia. What are some of the rituals that you've seen that maybe we don't really appreciate or not even aware of?
Well, it's interesting that you point out the ritual and tradition. Families have them, organizations have them, but cities have them as well. And a lot of times they manifest as sort of, as festivals, as sort of the event that always happens. There's Gasparilla, over in Tampa. The Daytona 500. And the whole buildup around that. There's sort of these very big event-driven kinds of things, and they're sort of the obvious ones. What I try to get communities to recognize is those other ones that are flying below the radar, the ones that don't necessarily get media coverage and bring in tens of thousands of people, but are maybe on a very hyper-local sort of basis, a neighborhood thing that every fall we do this, in the spring we do that, and let's celebrate those kinds of things, because those little things that are maybe done on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, those are the things that really matter to people. They really do connect emotionally to those small things.
So you're not saying that it has to be a Daytona 500.
No.
It can be a much smaller for a neighborhood. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, we had the neighborhoods, and we would go from house to house because the food that they cooked was just like you would go to a restaurant.
Yeah.
But we had so many different nationalities. So is that a sort of an example of?
If that was the thing that folks in your neighborhood
I remember
did,
that.
Yeah, and that was a great way to get to know your neighbors, and they would get to know you, and you'd taste new things. Those little traditions like that. I think we do ourselves a favor by sort of looking at those and embracing more of that. Because as much as we'd love to have the big event, the Daytona 500, Gasparilla, and things like that, there's only so much room for those kinds of things. I mean, I live in St. Petersburg, and it seems like every weekend there's something going on in the city, and that's a great thing. But imagine if you're trying to create a new tradition and things like that. Where do I shoehorn that into this already really busy schedule? If I'm trying to do something big. And I think that maybe trying to do something on a smaller scale, that maybe, doesn't have the, it's not, community, wide kind of stuff, but it's neighborhood based. That, I think, has rich possibilities.
We are a tourist destination. There's no doubt about that. Prime tourism for both states and for international travelers. How can we link, if we could love our cities, how can we link that in with the business, the economic business of tourism?
Well, I always say that when we go as tourists, we are essentially sort of trying on another place for size. We inevitably do it. We always go and we imagine ourselves, what would we like to live here? Things like that. And I think we get caught up in trying to create this sort of tourist experience. But I always have noticed that tourists like what locals think is cool. Of course you want to do, if you go to Paris, you're going to go to the Eiffel Tower, you're going to go to the Louvre, but then you want to see, well, what do the Parisians really like?
What's the best bakery down the corner?
What's the best bakery down the corner? if somebody comes to Orlando, of course they're going to go to Disney and Universal. They're going to do that. But at some point they're going to say, well, I wonder what's kind of authentic to Orlando, and they maybe find their way downtown. They find themselves in Lake Eola, and they go, wow, I had no idea this was here. Again, we pay a lot of attention to trying to make this great experience, on a tourist basis. But it comes back to, if we can make great local, a great place for the locals, the tourists will come, because they want to have that experience.
Just like the art district that we're building in downtown Orlando is coming along, and we know about it. But that wouldn't be somebody that comes from International Drive necessarily coming over here to see.
But when they, hopefully when they find that, they're going to be surprised and delighted. Go, wow, I had no idea that this was here. I thought it was all down by Disney and things like that.
Well, you talk about the importance of communication and the need for places for interaction with people. We'll have Sunrail coming on board in 2 years or less. Does the infrastructure for a mass transit system, will that help us sort of develop these places?
I'm a big fan of getting people out of their cars. And it's not because I'm anti-car or anything like that, but there's an impact of us being stuck in our cars. And that is, we are isolated. And I say in the book, I say the cars act as essentially a prophylactic against contact with other people. When we get out and we can walk, when we ride our bikes, and when we can get out of our cars and actually sort of, mass transit, Sunrail is a great example, we're going to interact with more people, and the quality of our life is going to go up because of that.
So I'll talk to this person I'm sitting next to me on the train?
Or, yeah, hopefully you do, or you're going to see some different things, or maybe you're going to have a time to read the newspaper, read a book, and something like that. That you're not going to be as frustrated as driving down I-4. So I was trying to get here. There's an accident, of course, and it's like I'm stuck in traffic, and things like that. And no, when we have this different sort of experience of getting out of our car, and just simply riding the train with other people, there is something about that we don't.
It's a social aspect.
Yeah, there is a social aspect, even if a word is not being said.
You're right.
We're in this together. Yet when we're in our cars and still, maybe we are stuck in traffic, we still feel very isolated, and we're throwing our virtual elbows and things like that, trying to get ahead of this guy. It's like, and that's very different.
Peter, what advice would you give to somebody who is engaged in their city but wants to take that step closer into loving the place? What would you tell them?
Aim low. That's a little surprising in a sense, because I meet with people all the time who have these very grand plans. They want to make big things happen, and I think that's fantastic. But big plans usually require big budgets, lots of people, lots of moving parts, lots of complexity. And especially for people who've not done these kinds of things before, it can be very intimidating, and it can be very daunting, especially when you run into the rules and regulations that are inevitable, zoning, and permits,
lots of things,
the insurance, the risk managers. The risk managers. That can absolutely, it's like, the heck with this, I'm going to go back and forget it, I'm not going to do it. But when we aim lower and we start trying to do something that is simple and attainable, and maybe more personal, more intimate, and we pull it off, wonderful. Because all of a sudden now we have this sense of, hey, I made that happen. We made that happen.
I was creative.
I was creative. We had fun. Look at the good we did. People are congratulating us. They're happy. They're smiling. Yes. And it's like, hey, what are we going to do next? And that is really what you're trying to, and maybe the next time they try for something bigger and bigger. And the home run that they were trying to hit, that they have in the back of their mind, they've hit a couple bunt singles and they've gotten on base and they've actually scored a run or two. Now they say, hey, I can play this game.
It empowers them to do some more.
It empowers them and encourages them, and they will be able to take on that bigger project.
Peter, thank you so much. I enjoyed reading the book. It's positive and just illuminating. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I've been talking about the relationship people have with where they live with For the Love of Cities author Peter Kageyama. Thank you for tuning in to UCF Metro Center Outlook. Until next time, I'm Diane Trees.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Metro Center, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.